what should go into an employee contract. Because there's something that I learned from a previous lawyer years ago that kind of shocked me. So he mentioned that if you don't get that contract right, there's a lot of weird situations that can happen. For example, people often think that if you have a contract, it kind of protects the employer, and it does if it is written properly and it is actually up to date. Because there's situations that could happen where, let's say you hire an employee on a contract for, hypothetically, let's say $100,000 a year for a project, and you terminate him within the first 3 weeks. Unless that contract was drafted very clearly, you might be liable to actually paying the full remainder of the contract, even though you fired the employee. And so this law firm that I had worked with years ago, they weren't working with lawyers, but mostly on the corporate side. They mentioned that this type of thing does happen surprisingly regularly, right? Or there might be things mentioned in that contract that either don't correlate with, I guess, the employment law, and it might invalidate your whole contract. So most people, they say, yeah, I do have a contract, but sometimes those contracts are downloaded from the internet off of a template, right? So what should go into an employee contract? Obviously, it's a huge question, but what I want to focus on is what are critical things that, if you're a dentist, you have employee contracts, like what should you check to make sure that they're in place, or maybe you should have that looked at again? Because there's that false sense of security, and then when it does come to litigation, they realize their contract that they signed 3-4 years ago with that staff member is completely worthless and does not help them.
It's funny now that you were saying this. I was thinking of an analogy that I never thought of before. Sometimes really downloading a contract or looking at a contract yourself and seeing that this looks good without properly reviewing it with a lawyer is like a car that looks good on the outside, but you have no idea, not if the engine is good, if it has an engine at all. Here's why. Some of the most important terms in an employment agreement are, for example, a termination clause. You can think that you've put anything and everything you want in an employment agreement and you've done a terrific job, but if you have employed someone, and we all know how time flies sometimes. So sometimes someone could start and before you know it, they've been there for 3 years or 4 years.
Yep.
The more time someone stays is a factor in deciding if and what someone is entitled to if there's no termination clause that is enforceable. So the longer someone stays, the more they're going to cost you money if that employment agreement that you have with them is not actually protected through a termination clause that limits how much you as an employer would have to pay an employee upon termination. Not just upon termination, upon even constructive dismissal allegations. So if you have an assistant who's saying, well, I was now forced to be recording my voice through these calls, and this is a big change of employment agreement for me, and that person's going to sue me, then a lot of these things will not happen in the sense that I'll make my answer a bit clearer and edit or whatever. A lot of the time, employees allege that something happened without really it happening. So if someone isn't nice with you one morning, they could say, my employer was actually being not nice. And now all of a sudden they're going and staying home and getting a doctor's note about bullying and harassment potentially, and about things that really aren't necessarily true. So without an employment agreement and a termination clause, you don't only have to terminate someone to have to pay these things, unfortunately. All has to happen is an employee may allege these things. The next thing you know, you may be on the hook without scaring people or employers about what can be alleged. I mean, not everything that is alleged or just said to have happened necessarily should be taken seriously. A lot of people allege things anytime. But anyway, if an employment agreement does not have a termination clause that minimizes entitlements upon termination, whatever kind of termination, to the Employment Standards Act, employers don't automatically have to pay Employment Standards Act. So one misconception a lot of the time people have, Nick, is, well, I hired someone and I worked with them for 2 years and I'm going to fire them now. And I paid them 2 weeks because that's what the Employment Standards Act says. Do you have a contract with them? No. Well, then this means that person's entitlements, if they go to a lawyer, are far more than the 2 weeks. If they go to the Ministry of Labor, they're only 2 weeks, because the Ministry of Labor actually only enforces to the point that the employment standards allows for. So not more than that. So that's why it is beneficial to employees generally to go to lawyers, because they can get money exceeding Employment Standards Act.
Yeah, it's almost like there's this whole economy of trying to attract disgruntled employees. And I have seen it where there are claims that seem rather far-fetched, right? Because like I would work with some of these dentists and it's like, they're really nice, down-to-earth people. I mean, they're not micromanagers.
Yeah.
They're you know, like they're one of them, like wonderful people to work with. They really encourage their staff. But sometimes if, you know, let's say it comes to light that a certain staff member is not performing on the same level of somebody else. And we look at this objectively, right? So when we measure calls or results, right? I don't care who's who knows who. I mean, for me, it's data. It says employee, like a receptionist A closes 40% of new patient leads into appointments. Receptionist B closes 18%, right? Now, receptionist B might be somebody that's worked there for 20 years. They might be like a family friend, you know, and this is where it starts to ruffle some feathers, because they might feel that sense of entitlement of, I've put my time in, there's nothing wrong with me, right? And they may not be open to training, right? And then often, if it spirals out of control, that employee might allege all kinds of silly things happening that, to me, I mean, I'm not sure, but it seems really far-fetched for the dentist in question, because I know them, and like that's just not something that they would do. And these types of things can, you know, they get swept under the rug until it becomes a really huge problem. And then it can be, you know, not only the money involved in trying to settle these lawsuits, but just the stress, the headaches, the fact that you can't sit there doing dentistry, you can't focus on your business because now you have to spend all this time trying to deal with some BS, essentially, right? So this is where, like, I really strongly believe in that whole, you know, prevent problems from happening. It is way cheaper, way, you know, you're going to have a lot less gray hair if you think that way of what could go wrong and plan it, instead of like, you know, running your business, just everything's okay for now. We'll just, you know, we'll just keep going. And then 3 years later in your lawsuit, right? So now I'm curious.
Sorry, Nick. So termination clauses are a catch-all to what could go wrong. So whether these allegations are raised or not, or whether you actually decide to terminate someone or not, having a termination clause that is enforceable will prevent from more money having to be paid. So let's say someone alleges something that's not true. We could say, let's pretend this is true. Fine, let's now look into the termination clause. Well, guess what? The termination clause says we only have to pay you X amount. So even with allegations that are absolutely false, we don't really care sometimes, and we shouldn't really care if ultimately the goal is the dollar amount is minimal at the end of the day. And termination clauses is exactly where an employer can put limiting these entitlements to the Employment Standards Act and not more.